What does the national media think of the Minnesota Wild start to the 2021-2022 season? We find out tonight here on Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. And just as a reminder, Locked On Wild is free and available wherever you listen to podcasts. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we take a look at where the national media has the Minnesota Wild throughout their 3-0 start, with a look at various power rankings throughout some of the major members of the NHL media. We also take a look at how the Wild did in the first week of the Locked On NHL Power Rankings. So a lot of looking at where the Wild sit and some of the reaction to what they have done. We'll try to weed out some of the power rankings that can maybe tell clearly haven't watched a whole lot of what's going on. Just trying to get kind of a sense of where the national media has the Wild to start off the season. My name is Seth Topal, host of Locked On Wild, veteran Minnesota sports content producer, a decade's worth of experience covering all Minnesota sports, and now covering the Minnesota Wild for my first full season here at Locked On Wild. Happy to have you along for a Thursday edition of the show. And as we mentioned, going to take a look at power rankings today. Plenty of websites that do them throughout the course of the national media, CBS Sports, NBC Sports, you name it. There are plenty that have taken a dive into the wide world of power rankings. And so just want to kind of get a sense of what the national media thinks of what the Wild have done so far this season. Now, we tried to find some examples that are both logical and some that maybe show a little bit of a lack of knowledge in regards to the Minnesota Wild. We'll also take a look today at the temperature of the Central Division, looking at how teams in the Central have done so far, and which starts we buy stock in and which starts we are not really sure what to think of yet. So, taking the temperature of the Central Division, also a huge part of today's episode as well, with a couple of off days before the Wild have a weekend series against Anaheim and Nashville. So, let's dive in and look at the power rankings here for tonight. And of course, wanted to start with a feature that we encourage you to keep an eye on throughout the course of the next couple of months, is the Locked On NHL Power Rankings. And the first week of the Power Rankings. Now, this is a feature that all of the Locked On NHL hosts vote on, and all of the votes are tabulated to give us the power rankings. So, yes, I did have a vote, and I will just say after we go through the list here, I will mention where I had the Wild based on this list. And so we start. The Florida Panthers get the top spot in the Week 1 power rankings. They were in 6th last week, so a huge jump for them up to number 1. Second place is the Penguins, who were at 10 last week, and they jumped up to the number 2 spot. Tampa Bay Lightning were at number 1 last week, and they dropped down to 3 this week. Then the Carolina Hurricanes, they hopped up from 8 to number 4. Number 5, the Colorado Avalanche. They were in 2nd place last week, so dropped down to 5th. The Toronto Maple Leafs at 6th in this week's power rankings. They were at 4 last week. Staying put was the Boston Bruins. They were at 7 last week and are at 7 this week. The Washington Capitals hop up a spot to number 9. They were from number 9. They were at 8 last week. The Edmonton Oilers up to number 9. They were at 11 last week. The Vegas Golden Knights in the 10th spot. They were third last week, so dropping all the way down to 10. Minnesota Wild in the 11th spot in the week 1 power rankings. They were at 15 last week, so jumping up 4 spots to this week, just ahead of the St. Louis Blues, who are in 12th. The Blues were in 14th last week. The New York Islanders were in 5th in the power rankings last week. They dropped down to 13. The New York Rangers at 13 last week. They're at 14 this week. The Dallas Stars were at 16 last week. They jump up to 15 this week. The Philadelphia Flyers at 17 last week. They jump up to 16 this week. The New Jersey Devils were at 20 last week. They hop up to 17 this week. The Columbus Blue Jackets with a big jump. They go from 28th last week to 18th this week. The Los Angeles Kings at 25th last week up to 19th this week. The Seattle Kraken at 22nd last week up to 20th this week. The Winnipeg Jets were at 12th last week. They dropped to 21st this week. The Buffalo Sabres at 32nd last week. They're up to 22nd this week. The Vancouver Canucks at 24th last week, up to 23rd now this week. The Detroit Red Wings at 27th last week. They're at 24 this week. The Blackhawks at 19 last week. They're at 25 this week, continuing to drop further down the power rankings. The Calgary Flames at 21 last week. They're at 26 this week. The Sharks at 26 last week. They're at 27 this week. The Senators at 29 last week. They're at 28 this week. The Montreal Canadiens at 18 last week. They're at 29 this week. The Anaheim Ducks at 30 stayed at 30 this week. The Nashville Predators 23 last week. They're down to 31 this week. And the Arizona Coyotes were 31st last week. They're 32nd this week. I had the Wild at 5th in the Locked On NHL Power Rankings. And so obviously a lot of the rest of the network not as high on the Wild as I am, but as I alluded to when tweeting out the power rankings for this week, would not surprise me if the Wild are in the top 10 next week, because I have been pretty adamant at the fact that I think this Wild team is going to go 6-2 in October, and I think if they do that, that's going to give them a nice leg up on the rest of the Central, especially early on, and especially with several of the Central Division teams in struggle mode to start off the season. So things looking pretty good for the Wild, all things considered. It will be interesting as we dive further into some of the national power rankings to see just what sorts of reactions the national media has to what this Wild team has done so far. And we are going to do that next. But we, as mentioned, 11th in the Locked On NHL Power Rankings for this week, and we'll see next week how far the Wild have hopped up in those rankings. We have more of the discussion to come as the national media temperature taken as to how the Wild have started the season continues here on Locked On Wild. BetOnline.ag is back, and they are better than ever. They feature a new web interface for the start of the basketball season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline.ag remains your number one spot for all the basketball and football action this season. So head to the new updated desktop or mobile website to sign up today and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Just make sure to use the promo code LOCKEDON to receive that welcome bonus. From basketball, football, baseball postseason, NHL, boxing, and UFC, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline.ag is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all of your favorite sports. BetOnline.ag, where the game starts. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild, and again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. Just as a reminder, Locked On Wild is free and available wherever you listen to podcasts. So let's take a look at some of the national power rankings to see where the Wild have been put through the first handful of games of the season. We'll start off with the CBS Sports power rankings. And how about this? CBS Sports has the Minnesota Wild number 1 in their power rankings. And here is what is said about the Wild as they start their season 3-0-0. The Wild were a sneaky team from last year, and they are off to a strong start this season. Minnesota's beaten two teams, the Kings and the Ducks, that failed to make the playoffs in 2020-2021, but the Wild play well in both games. It remains to be seen how long Minnesota will last at the top, but they earned it this week. Some of the other teams, we'll go with the top 10 for CBS Sports. They have the Avalanche at second, Panthers third. The Wild were at 7 last week, for what it's worth. So Wild up to first. Avalanche stay put at second. The Florida Panthers were at 4 last week. They're at 3 this week. The Carolina Hurricanes were at 5 last week. They are at 4 this week. Tampa Bay Lightning dropped from 4 to 5. The Toronto Maple Leafs dropped from 2 to 6. The Boston Bruins dropped from 1 to 7, so they flip places with the Minnesota Wild. Pittsburgh Penguins up 4 spots to 8. The Vegas Golden Knights drop 6 spots to 9, and the New York Islanders drop 5 spots to 10th in the CBS Sports Power Rankings. So again, Minnesota Wild, number 1 spot in the CBS Sports Power Rankings. We move to Elite Sports New York. And so, as I mentioned, trying to get kind of both ends of the spectrum of power rankings where you can kind of tell that those that put it together haven't really been paying attention to what the team has been doing, and then those that seems like they do. And so CBS Sports definitely falls into the paying attention category. Let's see what Elite Sports New York has to say about the Minnesota Wild. And the Wilds come in at 5th in these power rankings. They have the depth and they have the fight. The Wild have the passion and character as well as the necessary players to never be counted out of any game. Funny, I was just saying that in yesterday's episode as well. Expect another strong season from the Minnesota Wild. So this, I think, credible, has the Wild in the top 5, and notes some of those elements that we talked about in yesterday's episode, in which we said that the Wild can basically never be counted out of a game, which is entirely accurate. So I think these are accurate. Let's just see how the rest of the top 10 shakes out. The Columbus Blue Jackets in the top spot in these power rankings, which is kind of, I mean, yes, they're playing very well to start the season, but I don't know if anybody thinks that that is sustainable, what they have done so far this season. So, yeah, I mean, I would think that that is a little bit suspect, but Florida in the 2 spot, Carolina Hurricanes in the 3 spot, Edmonton Oilers just ahead of the Wild in the 4th spot in these power rankings, then the Minnesota Wild at 5th, the Buffalo Sabres at 6th. And yeah, Buffalo has had a sneaky good season to start the year. Whether or not it's sustainable is anybody's guess, as I think this team was widely expected to be fighting with Arizona for the worst team in the NHL. But nonetheless, 3-0 is a great start for them. Then we go to the Toronto Maple Leafs at 7, the Ottawa Senators at 8, Tampa Bay Lightning at 9, and the Pittsburgh Penguins round out the top 10 for the Elite Sports New York power rankings. Let's move to NBC and see what is said about the Minnesota Wild there. And we go to, let's just start from the top with these. You got the Florida Panthers as the number 1 team in the NBC Sports Power Rankings, followed by the Carolina Hurricanes at 2. The Toronto Maple Leafs at 3. Your Minnesota Wild, the 4th rated team in the NBC Sports Power Rankings. Not a whole lot said in this Power Rankings, but it's early. But Minnesota is the early team to beat in the Central. No arguments from me on that, because as of right now, the Avalanche dealing with COVID-19, trying to get Nathan McKinnon back and figured out on the ice. I would say, the Blues have had a very good start to the season as well. And just looking at these power rankings, they have the St. Louis Blues in 7, so not far behind the Minnesota Wild. And so those are your NBC Sports power rankings that have the Minnesota Wild 4th. So big consensus here from a lot of those national power rankings is the Wild belong in the top 5. Um, I tend to agree with that, as obvious with my rankings in the Locked On NHL Power Rankings. So NBC has the Wild at 4th. Let's take a look at Sports Illustrated, and their top 10 has the Florida Panthers at 1, Carolina Hurricanes at 2, Colorado Avalanche at 3, the Tampa Bay Lightning at 4th, Boston Bruins 5th, Vegas Golden Knights 6th, Toronto Maple Leafs 7th, Washington Capitals 8th, your Minnesota Wild at 9. Here's what Sports Illustrated had to say about the Minnesota Wild's start to the week, and the Wild were in the 9th spot last week as well. The Wild remain undefeated through 3 games, but they have lived on the edge. All of their wins have come by 1-goal margins, including an adrenaline-filled comeback overtime victory against the Jets. Accurate. Yes, the Wild have had to kind of play the cardiac kids so far to start this season, but I think that's been one of the things, honestly, that has helped this team out the most is that they were so used to close games last year and being able to complete those comeback wins late in the game that that was something that was obviously going to translate that they were ready for heading into this season. So, yes, as Sports Illustrated alludes, a lot of come from behind wins, 3 of them to be exact, and 3 games that were decided by 1 goal. So, yeah, I not a whole lot to be said, but at the same time, another inside the top 10. Now, here's an example of a power rankings in which it does not appear as though there's a whole lot of attention being paid to the Minnesota Wild. The Sports Not power rankings go like this. The Florida Panthers, who were previously ranked 8th in these power rankings, up to number 1. The Pittsburgh Penguins hop from 15 to 2nd. The Tampa Bay Lightning drop from 2 to 3. The Toronto Maple Leafs hop up from 5 to 4. Carolina Hurricanes up from 18 to 5. The Edmonton Oilers up from 13 to 6. The Colorado Avalanche drop from 1 to 7. The Vegas Golden Knights drop from 6 to 8. The Washington Capitals stay at number 9. The Boston Bruins drop from 3 to 10. Those were in one tier, and that tier was the I guess that was the legitimate contenders for the Stanley Cup final, because this is now the 2nd-tier contenders to watch out for in the new season. New York Islanders were previously ranked 4th in these power rankings, dropping to 11. The Winnipeg Jets went from 10 to 12. The St. Louis Blues went from 12 to 13. The Montreal Canadiens stayed at 14. The Seattle Kraken go from 7 to 15. Minnesota Wild, previously ranked 17th in these power rankings, hopping up to 16th this time. And here's what they have to say. The Wild have been one of the middling clubs in the league for a long time, and they have some promise and hope this season. After buying out Zach Parise and Ryan Suter, the Wild have a new lease on life and on rookies. They'll look to Kirill Kaprizov to continue his thrilling offense and hope Matt Dumba and Jared Spurgeon can hold the blue line down. No mention of Jonas Brodin, no mention of Kevin Fiala, and also weird to be behind the Winnipeg Jets, who the Wild just beat. So I don't know. That seems to be one that maybe we can throw out as an outlier for the purpose of these power rankings. So main point to take away from the beginning part of today's episode is that a lot of national media have the Wild amongst the top 10 in the NHL. Several have them within the top 5 for their start to the season. So it's not going unnoticed, which is kind of the custom for Minnesota sports, it seems. This time, definitely not going unnoticed by national eyes. So good to see that. And we will finish today's episode by taking a look at the Central Division and kind of taking the temperature of where every team is at, with some stock up or stock down That is coming up next here on Locked On Wild. Today's episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning, like is your Odyssey an LX or an EX? And why wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand that their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. You can save money and time while using rockauto.com. Why choose to spend 30, 50, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership? RockAuto.com is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years, and RockAuto.com's prices are reliably low for every customer. So head to RockAuto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Make sure to write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. All at rockauto.com. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. Just as a reminder, we are free and available wherever you listen to podcasts. Final segment, just taking a look and kind of taking the temperature of the Central Division, see whose stock we're buying to start the year and whose stock we are selling to start the season. So we'll start at the top of the division. St. Louis Blues coming in at 3-0 to start the year. They have a 15-8 goal differential, 15 goals scored in 3 games, 8 goals allowed. And so for the Blues, they come away with wins early on in the season against the Arizona Coyotes, the Colorado Avalanche, and the Vegas Golden Knights tonight by a score of 3-1. So have to say that I think as though the Blues are definitely for real to start off the season. And so I am definitely buying Blues stock this year. The offense seems to be doing very well to start the year, and Jordan Binnington looks pretty good to start the season as well. So I would say buy on St. Louis Blues stock here to start this season. Of course, the Minnesota Wild at 3-0. Talked about it at length yesterday in that we saw last night, we saw 2 nights ago, the Minnesota Wild kind of going from one of those teams that is good enough to a team that has the potential to be great by winning a game that they had no business winning. So I am definitely buying Wild stock for this season as well, because I think this team offensively is going to be one of the best in the NHL, and as a result, they'll have unlimited amounts of chances to win games, and they're just going to need the defense and the goaltending to be good enough to make a play here or there to impact the game, and that is a totally winnable formula for this team. So I am also fully buying as much Minnesota Wild stock as possibly exists so far this season. Next up is the Dallas Stars at 2-2 so far this year with a goal differential of -1. They've scored 8 goals. They've given up 9. I really don't know what to make of this Dallas Stars team so far. I mean, you look at what they've done in the 4 games that they've played. They beat the Rangers 3-2. They lost to the Bruins 3-1. They lost to the Ottawa Senators 3-2, and they beat the Pittsburgh Penguins 2-1. Yeah, I'm gonna need to see more from this Dallas team before I can put an opinion together as to if they're going to be good this season or if this is just going to be kind of one of those weird win a couple, lose a couple type teams pretty much the whole year. So I am going to hold on Dallas Stars stock because I really have no idea what to expect from them this year. And those, as crazy as this sounds, those are the only 3 teams in the division that have multiple wins. You have the Nashville Predators who come in at 1-2, and I am selling Nashville Predator stock in the absolute worst way possible. Nashville is going to be a team that, just offensively it's going to be a struggle for them. And you look at how they have started the year. They lost 4-3 to the Kraken, lost 3-2 to the Hurricanes, and they beat the Los Angeles Kings 2-1. So I'm selling Nashville stock because I think this team really put everything they had into it last year, and it's going to be so hard for them to repeat what they did last season in really catching lightning in a bottle. So I'm selling Nashville stock. I am buying like crazy Colorado Avalanche stock. So look at these numbers so far for the Colorado Avalanche. They're 1-2 on the season. They've scored 10 goals. They've given up 13 goals. Let's keep in mind they're dealing with COVID-19. They will be getting Nathan McKinnon back and getting him back into the lineup this week. And so, yes, it may seem like a good idea to kind of discount the Avalanche and say, well, yeah, it's a bad start for them, and I don't know if they're going to recover. But come on, it's the Colorado Avalanche, so I'm for sure buying stock in the Colorado Avalanche, despite the slow start to this season. And the final three teams here in the Central, the Winnipeg Jets, they come in at 0-2-1. And after what we saw against the Minnesota Wild, selling like crazy. That Winnipeg team, yes, was shorthanded against the Wild, but I mean that goaltending situation with Connor Hellebuck, unless he goes on an absolute run this year, it's not going to be enough for them to get in and do anything. So I'm selling Winnipeg Jets stock. I'm also going to sell Arizona Coyotes because at 0-2-1 right now, they're not the worst team in the division, but they have the worst goal differential at 7 goals for, 17 goals against. So a -10. They don't have a lot really to get excited about on that team. And so they're going to be last in the division, and they'll probably be last in the conference. So I'm going to sell Arizona stock, and I'm also going to sell Chicago Blackhawks stock. Chicago is 0-3-1 to start the season. They've scored 8 goals. They've given up 17. Their defense is hideous, and Marc-Andre Fleury has not been himself to start the season. This team has a penchant for falling behind within the first couple of minutes of games, which puts them at a major disadvantage for the rest of that game when they give up a goal within the first 2 minutes. And there's talk that their head coach is on starting to get on the hot seat. It all leads to a bad formula for this Blackhawks team that I just don't see them being able to dig their way out of. And yes, that may sound like a hot-ish type of take with the fact that we're 3 games into the season, 4 games in some cases, but mostly 3 games into the season. But trends are things that come and go. Some things are fixed, some things are not. I don't think Chicago will be one of those things. So at this point, we're buying stock in St. Louis, Minnesota, and Colorado. We are holding on the Dallas Stars, and we're selling on the Nashville Predators, Winnipeg Jets, Arizona Coyotes, and Chicago Blackhawks. That will be a weekly bit going forward. We'll try to do that on off days, when we have a couple of off days back to back. I know next week there are a ton of games on the schedule. So we'll sneak that in when we can, but always interesting to just kind of see where the national media is looking at things from a Minnesota Wild perspective. And so for this week, looks like they're pretty solidly entrenched in the top 10 with not a whole lot of stock to be bought with their division opponents. So not a bad week to start off the season for the Minnesota Wild, all things considered. And it continues this weekend with games on Saturday and Sunday, a chance to go to 5-0 on the season with a few games left in October after that. That is going to wrap it up for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. And now that you're finished with listen number 1, make sure to head over to the Locked On NHL podcast to get the full rundown on the NHL as things keep rolling here with the first week of games already in the books. So make sure to find the Locked On NHL podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Make sure that you're also up to date on all Locked On Wild content and episodes by subscribing wherever you listen and following us on YouTube, following us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We have a ton of content coming out for you here as the season gets rolling. So make sure you don't miss out on a second of it by searching Locked On Wild and following us everywhere that pops up. Also, make sure to keep an eye out for new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.